with attendees. These are two formats in which the conference is going to be broadcast, and our theme this year is Global Shocks, Security Implications of Major Worldwide Crises. I'm here to introduce the commencing panel, Past Shocks and Present Day Echoes, presented by the school's research theme in military and political history, of which I am one of the co-directors. And this panel will showcase the research in the biggest concentration of military historical research in the UK, which is under this theme. Of course, as historians, we know that global shocks are not new. They are regular. We've had 3 already in the 21st century. We've had 9/11, we've had the 2008 banking crisis, and now we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And we might, of course, expect many more in our lifetimes. They're certainly a historical phenomenon. Myself, as a historian of the First World War, studied a period when they were recurrent. The World War itself, its consequences, the threat of international Bolshevism, the economic depression that followed the First World War, and the Spanish flu pandemic all occurred in quick succession. The world got through these, and I appreciate the world will get through shocks that we experience today. Whether, of course, we've learned from early experiences, we can certainly at least contextualize and gain a central perspective from historical comparisons. But our presenters today will look back as far as ancient Greece, although the focus, which reflects the focus of historical research in the military and political history theme, will be on the 20th century. We have 5 speakers, 2 doctoral students in the department, and 3 members of the academic teaching staff. The speaking order you will have seen on the conference program, so I won't repeat it. We have, just to let you know logistically, if the presentations will be followed by a discussion session. There is an ability, if you are a participant in the Zoom webinar, to ask a question through the Q&A function. As convener of the panel, I will monitor these questions and feed some of those into the discussion that will follow the presentation. But I don't want you to sit here and listen to me. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, Kakuta, who is a PhD student in the War Studies Department. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just give me 2 seconds while I get my PowerPoint up. As Bill has introduced me already, my name is Kunika. I'm in final year of PhD in the Department of War Studies. I'll be talking about Thucydides and democracy and the plague. Right. So School of Security Studies is no stranger to Thucydides. From Thucydides often included as a classical realist to Graham Allison's Thucydides trap. Although classicists are not always thrilled to see constant misquotes of Thucydides by social scientists, the one positive thing to be said about Allison's model is that it focuses on a specific historically generalizable dynamic between 2 powers, not drawing spurious analogies between ancient Greece and the modern state. Yet in the current COVID-19 pandemic, many modern commentators have rushed to draw parallels to the plague of Athens in 430 BC, which broke out immediately after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. Some have gone as far to claim that the plague has ruined Athenian democracy. This paper will demonstrate that Thucydides does not blame plague for the decline of democracy. And I argue that his narrative is clear that neither the plague nor democracy were the reason behind the decline of Athenian power. It is understandable why the plague has been compared to the current pandemic. The Athenians were in effect under a lockdown before the plague broke out. The inhabitants of Attica were forced to move inside the long walls that ran from Piraeus to the city to avoid Spartan attacks on the plains of Attica. Thucydides tells us that the plague was of foreign origin, which fell on Athens suddenly and first affected the inhabitants of the Piraeus. And some even rumor that it was a Peloponnesian attempt to poison the whales, much like Trump blaming China on this outbreak. Thucydides writes that some Athenians ignored the law during the pandemic and sought for immediate pleasures, which became the new honor and new value. But Thucydides does not say the plague ruined democracy. Athens experienced a temporary lawlessness under the plague because Athenians feared catching the plague. Thucydides believes that the decline of Athenian rule was to be blamed on the successor of Pericles, such as Cleon and Alcibiades, who sought for first positions that they were inclined to indulge popular whim even in matters of state policy. He criticizes them for allowing personal accusation made in the pursuit of political supremacy to blunt effectiveness of the military, which led to the inevitable in a great city with an empire to rule to a series of mistakes. The dominant men of Athens were driven by the pursuit of power and greed. They turned to the passions of party rivalries, employing fine-sounding terms whether they were pro-democracy or oligarchy. The factional discord Athens experienced was more likely to be the real cause of decline and downfall, not the plague. Thucydides preferred policies of Pericles, which focused on the maintenance of Athenian naval power, in which her strengths lay, keeping firm hand on the allies as the naval power dependent on the revenue received from them, and defending their polis. In contrast, Cleon sought even more aggressive imperialist policy by going out to battles and expanding their empire. For example, the campaign in Pylos in 427 BC was certainly a success, yet their victory led to hubris, thinking that they could even conquer Sicily. These military campaigns were costly, and this led to Athens demanding more tributes from the allies. This increased allies' dislike towards Athens and thus leading to increased number of revolts against her rule. Ultimately, this weakened Athens' naval power. While the disastrous outcome at the Sicilian expedition of 415 BC may be seen as the result of the incompetent democratic system, Thucydides does not say that one constitution was superior or incompetent than the other, nor does he blame specific types of constitution for the errors made during the war. His approval is in a context where demos is shown in contrast to the many. The only passage in which Thucydides explicitly tells us the reader of his political preference is in the description of the rule of 5,000. He writes, "And now for the first time, at least in my lifetime, the Athenians enjoyed a political system of substantial and obvious merit, which blended the interest of the few and the many without the extremes, and began to restore the city from wretched situation into which it had fallen." Thucydides' personal insights suggest that he disliked any extreme form of political systems which produce discord or violence, whether that is democracy or oligarchy. Thucydides believed that the existence of political dictonomy implies discord, and the existence of democracy or oligarchic system that meant a divided society. And therefore, Thucydides equally condemns oligarchy in a similar manner. For example, he mentions Spartans' refusal to support Brasidas on the river Strymon, just like the Athenians' refusal to support Alcibiades in Sicily. It is not just the Athenians who behaved outrageously to their allies or to their enemies at Milos or Mytilene or at Sicily. Spartans too behaved similarly at Plataea or Hysiae, or even conducting mass murder of Helots after their defeat at Pylos. Although Athens continued her war efforts after disaster at Sicily, salvation of their city was at stake, making Athenians accept unthinkable thought, that is, replacing their democracy with the rule of 5,000, and later by the rule of 400, so that Persian king may give them financial aid. A change in government would not have been accepted at the beginning of the war. The Athenians were more interested in money than democracy itself or political freedom associated with it. Even initially, they were upset by the thought of constitution change. They accepted oligarchic government. When they restored democracy and continued with their final, but at the same time, they have managed to restore their democracy and continue with their final war efforts until the Battle of Aegospotami in 403 BC, in which Athens' fleets were finally destroyed. By then, Spartans have achieved its hegemony in ancient Greece, and the Athenians faced second constitution change in 404 BC, this time placed under stricter oligarchic rule of 30. The current pandemic has highlighted increased misinterpretation and misquotation of Thucydides. Worse, there has been spurious analogies drawn between COVID-19 pandemic challenging the current Western liberal values and democracy to the plague of Athens and Athenian political discourse. The best lesson we can draw from this is that one must be careful to draw specific historical analogy to the present or even to the future, especially if it ends up being drawing spurious analogies between ancient Greece and the modern state. The plague of 430 BC did not ruin the Athenian democracy, nor did it affect their empire. What weakened Athenian democracy and had power the reckless personal ambitions of political leaders and allied revolts that led to socio-economic changes, which ultimately weakened the Athenian naval power. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Greg Kennedy, and I'm here this morning to talk about the United States and the effects of strategic shocks over history and their applicability or perhaps not applicability to the current crisis that the United States is facing. Within the historiography of the United States and American power, you find a number of schools that talk about the idea of strategic shock. Now, looking at strategic shock, there are two elements to this, of course. One is that you would have to define strategic and the strategic level within the United States. Is that the governing or policymaking elite, or is it public opinion? And given the centrality of public opinion to American strategic policy, I would argue that the impact of strategic shock must be first and foremost felt and embodied into the public and public opinion. Sorry, this speaks to a number of reasons then for the need to understand the shock. Is it a physical manifestation? So for anybody who's experienced shock themselves, it is a case of the cold and the paralysis, a vast amount of adrenaline that's followed by an inability to really do anything as your body struggles to react. Or is it a state of mind in terms of a shocking way in which your perceptions of how the world works or what was to occur are no longer valid? And within the American public, I would argue that these are much more fragile and therefore much more manipulative to events. And the creation of strategic thought by either external or internal actors than say the governing or policy making elite, who are more resilient to such change. So if we take a look in terms of the traditional discussions of the impact of strategic thought, a number of them come to mind. So internalized conflict, the Alamo being a way in which an atrocity is turned into a banner for rallying around to the creation of a new understanding of the limits of the United States. The same is true in the Spanish-American War with the Maine. Now, these incidents in and of themselves don't have what we'd call modern interpretations of strategic thought because of the limited amount of either territorial or physical damage that is actually done, the sinking of one ship or the loss of one particular fortified area. But it's the shock to the public understanding of America and what American values are being challenged over. One, in the case of particularly the Spanish-American War, the difference between the isolated God special nation in the face of a corrupt, bankrupt, old European imperial power. So both of those incidents can create then and have a ripple effect that manifests themselves into the concept of strategic thought. Of course, two of the more famous ones are the sinking of the Lusitania in World War I, and of course in World War II, the entry of the United States into the conflict through the probably greatest of all strategic thought shocks to the American historical memory in Pearl Harbor. Both of those have also this kind of innocence value to them that is particularly important in terms of being able to mobilize the American public to a cause that follows a path of righteousness, this idea within the historiography of the innocent American rising to the righteous crusade to rescue or to correct or to protect. And certainly those strategic thoughts, shocks in terms of the Lusitania and Pearl Harbor and the way that they've been portrayed contemporarily to the public, but also in terms of the historiography, completely miss the point that at the policymaking elite level, the United States is deeply embedded into already a number of elements at the strategic level that don't make it an innocent actor. And in many cases, one could argue that they are a catalyst. So it should be no shock to the system as to what it is, that the outcome is that either the German response is what it is, or that the Japanese response is what it is in the face of sanctions, embargoes, and a strangulation of its ability to create and generate power to wage modern warfare. Not all of the shocks have been negative, if one wants to term in that sense. You can look certainly in terms of a negative shock being the surprise, the strategic shock delivered by the Soviet Union post-World War II in terms of Sputnik, and the fact that, you know, this backward, relatively technologically unable country now is leading the space race. But that is then countered by, of course, the victory and another strategic shot, a domestic strategic shot, I would argue, which is the American rallying and unification around this to create the Apollo missions and the ability to win the race to the moon, which then generated a number of continuities in terms of the idea of the conquering of space and American control of the planet and the space around it, really. This is brought kind of back to earth, if you will, in terms of the strategic shock of this, I would argue, first wave of hegemonic post-World War II thinking for the United States. It's actually second wave, probably. And that is, of course, the defeat in the Vietnam War, which then opened up a number of things, not just the military defeat, the strategic shock or the shock of the military power and might of the United States being inadequate, but the whole idea of American values and Americanism and its righteousness and its differentiation from the rest of the world. And was it any different? And the whole debate then within the historiography post-Vietnam, particularly over the last 10 years, about the idea of imperialism, which can, you know, you go to Neil Ferguson's Colossus, to Edward Mead Earl's Blood, Gold, and Treasure, the whole idea about America's special place and whether or not it is special or any more different than what previous imperial systems had to offer. So what you have with COVID, I would argue, is a break from what you might be able to see as having been a way in which these external threats or threats to the American values, even in the case of Vietnam, and the first fractures, if you will, within their modern society along race and economic and political lines, is that the problem with COVID is that there's no enemy. Even with Vietnam, you can get the Summers treatise, which says, you know, didn't lose any battles. It was the stab in the back theory, really, that it was the politicians and the waging of war, and only if it had been done better, the outcome would have been different. Again, the lack of ability to deal with the internal problems as being dominant in these situations as opposed to the external. So very Bismarckian, very the idea of the generation of the other to create a unified whole. When you look at the COVID problem, what it does is it comes at a particularly inopportune time. The recovery from the 2008 crisis had already started questions about American economic dominance and the questions of values of their form of capitalism. This has now been exacerbated by the inability to even find an enemy in COVID. An attempt to try and put this off to China seems to have not gotten off the ground in the way in which the Trump administration thought it could generate that other. And now combined with the racial and social inequalities that have been manifest, you know, in the modern American system for the last 50 years, these things have come together to have to make them look at themselves. So this is why I would argue with COVID-19, it is a strategic shock, but it's not a strategic shock in the sense of traditionally historians have dealt with. And if you look at the debate that is kind of going on right now between, say, people like Bresner and Lagavall within H. Diplo and others, this question about putting the domestic condition of the United States first before the external in terms of being able to understand power and therefore where strategic shock would have an effect, I think is particularly timely. And it is the looking and the ability to look internally at the United States as itself and then link that to foreign and military, external strategic national security type thinking that has been lacking in the themes of American historiography and its study. When you don't have an appreciation for the domestic condition, it is easy to have this kind of idea and thought that the power is only an external question, and therefore any strategic thought is an external event. I think that's true at all. The primacy, if you go back to James Bryce's American Commonwealth at the turn of the century, you understand, turn of the 19th, 20th century, you understand quite clearly that the American public is their strategic center of gravity, and what affects the American public and how it's perceived and what the danger and what the threat is where a strategic thought lies, not in terms of a policy-making elite and not in terms of just externalized or externally perceived threats. So with COVID-19, this is a particular shock that is opening up a number of questions about the great superpower and actually how perhaps weak, unfailing, inhumane, unable, and unready it has been as a society, as an economy, as a system of organization in order to be able to create power, to protect citizens, and to value citizens. So I think it is definitely a strategic thought, but it is not the traditional unifier. In my title, there should have been a question mark after the great unifier, by the way. The idea that this now is a great unifier, I would argue, no, it is not. The great unifier will come probably in a great deal of time as the ramifications of this event are dealt with. But as far as I can tell at this moment, historically, it is asymmetric to the traditional kind of valorization of what a strategic thought, a strategic shock to the American national security system is. And as such, it, I think, is creating a United States that is extremely undirected, vulnerable, will feel itself to be vulnerable, and therefore able to react in irrational or in fearful ways, and in ways that are not conducive to long-term or even medium-term solutions that are collective or indeed helpful, given the position that it occupies within the world's power order. So that's my take on the kind of relationship between COVID, its comparison to past strategic thoughts for the United States. And it's now over to Ignacio. Thank you very much.
Well, hi, everyone. Let me share my screen. There we are. In terms of shocks, this presentation will assess the role of individual shocks in soldiers, particularly under fire, soldiers deployed in combat, and how to assess the role of radicalization. So, first of all, this is my presentation structure. Only 4 points because we only have 10 minutes. Introduction, context, a very important question. Is it possible to open the scope of radicalization studies, especially in regards with the many interpretations of that concept? And third place, case studies in which I'm involved now. And fourthly, what are my primary and secondary sources? So this is the question in my research nowadays. Since 9/11, a lot of energy has been put in trying to understand the process of radicalization related to security studies and terrorism. And you can see here in this slide, it's pretty normal to find a kind of relation between radicalization, ideology, and social grievances in terms of trying to understand terrorism or terrorist actors, lone wolves, individuals, and so on. So my intention nowadays is to open the scope of radicalization studies and put attention into war studies. If we change that narrative and we move the interpretation of radicalization towards war studies, we have two main roads. First of all, it's getting into the quote unquote traditional way, radicalization ending in genocide, war crimes, barbarization, and so on. But that has to do mainly with the participation of entire armies, decision makers, generals, politicians, and so on. Not necessarily the attention is put on in soldiers. So my intention is to open the scope here and try to relate radicalization with the violence of combat and how that violence affect individual soldiers in the middle of battle. So the big question is how the level of violence involved in combat can be naturalized by soldiers, and this affect them as a virus, speaking of viruses, in their mind, and they start to act in ways in which they wouldn't be acting like in quote unquote normal terms. So the idea of radicalization, the definitions of radicalizations could be applied to war studies, especially to individual soldiers engaged in battles. So if you see the slide, if you follow the red arrows, radicalization can be applied into war studies if we consider the level of violence, which is pretty normal in warfare scenarios. And I argue as well that that level of violence is pretty normal to be naturalized by soldiers, and that could result in brutal behaviors, which could end, not necessarily, in genocide, war crimes, barbarization, and so on. So in terms of definitions, we have many definitions of radicalization, especially, as I said before, after 9/11. I choose only two. Peter Neumann in his article, The Trouble with Radicalization, and Julian Richards in his book, Extremism, Radicalization, and Security Studies. The interesting point here is both authors put their attention on terrorism studies, not necessarily in war studies. So my point here is that we can use this framework, this narrative, and try to understand radicalization of soldiers in combat as well, because we are not pretty used to speak about radical soldiers. And I think it's time to open that scope and not to demonize soldiers, but to be able to say and to argue that at some point soldiers are affected by the level of violence, and it's not necessary to be part of an ideological group or maybe to different kind of ideas to be radicalized. You can be radicalized only by being affected by the level of violence showed in combat. You can see here some ideas, the idea of extremist beliefs that could end, not necessarily, but in cognitive radicalization and behavioral radicalization. So moving the ideas into action. And as Peter Neumann said, at the most basic level, radicalization can be defined as the process whereby people become extremists. And you can, that's my point at least, you can be radicalized in battle. You can be an extremist, not related to ideologies, as I said before, but especially to the level of violence inflicted in war, sorry. So this is a very important question, how to assess the spectrum of legitimate violence inflicted by soldiers in combat, because we understand that we have legitimate violence inflicted on your enemies. If you want to win the war, you need to inflict violence, but at the same time, we recognize some kind of spectrum in that level of violence. And when we recognize that, we say that some actions are legitimate and other actions are out of order. So this is in relates to this definition. Julian Richards argues something pretty similar, and he says that on the matter of radicalization, the key question here is what is signified by the process and what the process does to the identity of the individual concerned. And this is very interesting because it is very difficult to find in general terms the idea of radicalization trying to explain soldiers in combat. We're very used to speak about radicalization in ideological terms, in security studies, in studies related to terrorism, but not into war. When we speak about war studies, we always get into, as I said before, war crimes, barbarization of warfare, brutality, and so on. So I think it's time, almost 20 years after 9/11, to open the scope of radicalization studies and get into conventional armies. Now, case studies. I'm working in 2 case studies nowadays. First of all, the British soldiers in Burma and the American soldiers in the Pacific Theater, both between 1942 and 1945. Maybe you could ask why Burma and why the American soldiers in the Pacific? Well, first of all, why Burma? The easiest answer is this is the first time when the British forces in cooperation with Indian military and many other actors engaged in jungle warfare, and that kind of warfare is pretty ferocious. So in terms of violence and the idea of the peripheral context in which those soldiers were fighting, it's pretty common to find sources speaking about the level of violence inflicted by Japanese forces against their enemies, in this case, the British. But my question is, what about the British facing the Japanese in jungle warfare? Is this idea of the peripheral war or maybe the forgotten armies related to the idea of soldiers showing a behavior different to the behavior showed in the Western Front, for example? This is a very interesting idea that I think it needs to be assessed. In terms of the American soldiers in the Pacific, well, we don't have many time for this, but it's pretty similar. The idea of peripheral war, the idea of ferocious enemies, the conditions of jungle warfare, and how these conditions can affect the behavior of soldiers, not necessarily followed by ideas of racial biases or radical ideologies trying to understand their enemies, but affected by the level of violence they experienced in combat. That's the main point. In terms of sources, this is a list of memoirs of British soldiers in Burma, and I'd recommend, first of all, George MacDonald Fraser, quoted saved out here, Harrowing Tale of World War II, and you can find there a pretty convincing argument in regarding to the use of violence and how that violence can affect soldiers in the middle of battle. So I can recommend that reading. And you can see here, lastly, some sources before the beginning of this pandemic, which I found in the National Archives related to moral reports and how the British Army assessed at that time the behavior of soldiers in combat. So just as an end note, my idea is, again, to open the scope of radicalization studies, move away from terrorism and security studies and get into war studies with the same kind of narrative that we can find in those cases, but now into the violence inflicted by soldiers in combat. Thank you for being here.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm Christina Goulter. Along with Bill Philpott, I'm the co-lead of the military and political history theme. My topic this morning is disease, famine, and fratricide, the Axis occupation of Greece, 1941-1944. This paper falls out of my forthcoming book about British intervention in Greece, 1944-45. And some of the issues I couldn't quite squeeze into my book, I'm now going to do it as a separate article. British intervention in Greece was done in order to restore the Greek government, which had been in exile throughout the Axis occupation, and to prevent a civil war between the communist and republican elements within the Greek resistance. The intent was also to provide humanitarian relief to the Greek population. Given that this was performed in the context of a world war with major war fighting still going on in Northwest Europe as well as in the Pacific, I think it's a very interesting case of stabilization, relief, and reconstruction performed by cross-government and international organizations under extreme pressure. I think most people just focus on the Marshall Plan as the chief instrument for rebuilding, particularly Europe, but other theaters as well after World War II. But what this case proves is that relief and reconstruction were already occurring before the Second World War had ended. And what I think this points to is a political and military apparatus which was very responsive, and the results achieved do not merely rival any modern example, but I think in many ways exceed what the UK and US would consider to be best practice today. The Axis invasion and occupation of Greece during the Second World War caused the death of in excess of 8% of the population, some 360,000 people. And people aren't aware of the scale of suffering that occurred in Greece during the war. Some of these casualties were the result of fighting, which occurred in the 1940-41 time frame, but the remainder were caused by brutalization of the population by the Italian, German, and Bulgarian occupiers, famine, disease, and internecine violence between the two principal resistance groups, the Republican Athens and the Communist Hellas. The latter was controlled by the Greek Communist Party, and this made two bids during the Second World War to take power by monopolizing the resistance with a view to the period after occupation. First bid for power occurred in 1943, and a more serious bid in December of 1944, which is the subject of my forthcoming book. The third round, between 1946 and 1949, is commonly referred to as the Greek Civil War proper, but I think it's much easier to view the 43 to 49 period as a continuum, because you can't understand the Greek Civil War proper without reference to the two earlier bids for power. There were also historical schisms within Greek society, mainly between royalists and republicans, which were exacerbated by the Axis occupation, and a lack of unified national response to Italian, German, and Bulgarian aggression in 1940 to 41 period merely opened the back door for the Greek Communist Party and allowed it to control most of the resistance. Britain, for its part, had great difficulty navigating her way through the complexity of Greek politics. If we think we're suffering at present through that, it's peanuts in comparison with the interwar years. And what Britain had to do was to balance wartime imperatives and post-war political interests in the region. The obvious wartime imperative was to defeat the Axis powers, but post-war interests in the region also led Britain to support the Greek king. He had been exiled during the interwar years due to the violent swings in Greek politics between pro and anti-monarchist parties, but the Greek king was also an outspoken supporter of the UK at the start of the Second World War. This put British foreign policy at odds with having to support the two principal resistance groups, Republican Athens and Communist Alas. And the UK faced even a greater dilemma when the Anglo-American military chiefs saw Alas in particular as the most credible resistance group because of its size and therefore capable, they thought, of inflicting the greatest damage on the Axis occupiers. This assessment actually turned out to be incorrect. Alas did comparatively little fighting against German, Italian, or Bulgarian occupiers and was procuring Allied weaponry and funding for its longer-term ambition of installing a communist government in Greece at the time of liberation. By autumn of 1943, it was very clear that Alas was intent on eliminating other non-communist groups. In October of that year, it launched a major attack on Athens, and although Athens survived thanks to ongoing British support, it was seriously weakened. And what this did was to embolden Alas. It established a rival government in the mountains in direct opposition to the exiled Greek government in Egypt. The average Greek now had a huge dilemma. Do I support the government in situ, or do I support the legitimate government exiled in Egypt? And this separation of loyalties led to mutinies within the Greek armed forces, which had managed to escape from Greece in 1941. And these mutinies lasted for several weeks, April, May 1944, but was successfully brought under control by the Anglo-Greek military hierarchy. The armed forces were subjected to close vetting procedures to root out communist agitators. And what this meant, it was a major blow to the communists' aspiration to use the Greek armed forces at the end of the occupation in order to take power. By the late summer of 1944, the Germans were the last remaining Axis occupier. Italy had surrendered in 1943, and the Bulgarians had changed sides in September. But as the German forces started to withdraw, Alas took the opportunity to attack any Greek they suspected of being non-communist or a collaborator. Reports started to arrive in the Allied Middle East headquarters about Alas's atrocities, and they threatened to kill upwards of 60,000 civilians when they reached Athens. And these threats were taken very seriously, and the Middle East HQ brought forward plans to intervene in Greece. So what was originally conceived of as a stabilization and humanitarian relief operation very quickly developed into a counterinsurgency campaign. 2 British brigades, which had been sent to Greece in October, found themselves surrounded in the center of Athens by 5,000 Alas fighters. And what materialized was a very intense urban counterinsurgency campaign lasting some 6 weeks. With close air support and airdrops of food and weapons, the British campaign succeeded. The UK lost 200 personnel to some 3,000 Alas members killed. The Greek Communist Party concluded after this that it needed to develop a conventional fighting capability in order to prevail, and Alas morphed into the communist DSE regular army. And what this did was to merely play into the hands of the reformed and rebuilt Greek National Army, which finally beat the last communist challenge during the 3rd round, or the so-called Greek Civil War proper, between 46 and 49. There are a number of remarkable features to this little-known campaign in December 44, January 45. And the most notable is the way in which Anglo-Greek headquarters in Athens had two main wings, one military, one civil. These wings worked side by side to deliver simultaneous security and welfare packages, and the Greek and British personnel worked closely in tandem. The Greek civilian population was fed by British forces throughout this period, thanks to air resupply. This was a population which had suffered two major famines during the occupation, after the invasion of Greece, first by the Italians in 1940, and then by the Germans and Bulgarians in 1941. Crops had been abandoned, and Greek men of fighting age disappeared either into the hills in the form of resistance or joined the regular fighting forces. Then throughout the occupation, the Germans in particular confiscated agricultural production, 90% of crops, animal stocks, and fish stocks. During the very harsh winter of 1944, this led to thousands dying of starvation. During the December 44, January 45 fighting in Athens, airdrops not only supplied the Anglo-Greek forces trapped in the center of Athens, but crucially fed several thousand Greek civilians caught inside the green zone in the center of the city. When fighting ceased, even a hard-pressed Britain provided seed grain and potatoes to Greece for spring sowing. Of equal concern for the combined British and Greek headquarters in Athens was the fact that the civilian population had been severely malnourished during most of the occupation and now was very susceptible to disease. Sanitation remained a serious problem across the whole of the country because during the occupation, all the sewerage infrastructure which had been destroyed or damaged in 1941 fighting had not been repaired. Excremental diseases were rife and other diseases flourished. TB trebled over the pre-war figure. In the Cycladic Islands, over 25% of the children had tuberculosis. It was a similar case with malaria. During the 1930s, the Greek government had done a lot to drain swamps and to do anti-malarial measures, but all that was abandoned during the occupation. And as a result, over 70% of the population had malaria. In some regions, diseases such as anthrax reappeared after an absence of decades. The incidence of venereal disease and typhus also increased exponentially in the cities. There are very few good news stories in this period, mainly because the Germans in particular had plundered most of the hospital and medical equipment. But one of the very rare positive notes was a decline of rabies. The senior British military officer noted with very wry humor that rabies had declined in Greece simply because, and I quote, cats were a favorite article of diet for one of the occupying nations. Diplomacy prevents my saying which one. The feeding of the Greek population with a steady influx of shipping from December 44 onwards and the rebuilding of basic infrastructure went a long way to restoring the health of the Greek populace. This effort was done in conjunction with other organizations, including the Red Cross and what was known as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Now, this title is a little confusing because the UN, as we know it, didn't come about formally until October of 1945. The United Nations, in the case of UNRWA, referred to the 40+ allied nations, but with the UK and the US in the leading role. A British Treasury team was embedded in the Anglo-Greek headquarters in Athens, and this set about re-establishing a functional economy, and a major part of this was dealing with the hyperinflationary currency. The HQ found its remit expanding on a daily basis, and departments were set up to deal with policing, justice, records, and even fine arts, because the occupying forces had plundered a lot of the basic artwork. And I think all these measures combined were essential for restoring not merely basic functioning within Greek society, but also crucially restoring national pride and unity. Retribution management was one of the most important roles for the newly restored justice system, and bringing collaborators and those responsible for internecine violence went a long way to establishing normalcy in Greece, at least for a year before the communists made their final bid for power. However, What was learned in this critical period, 44-45, was applied with even greater vigor in the 1946 to 49 Greek Civil War period, and led to lasting peace and security in the country, the rebuilding of society's fabric, and all of this was underpinned further by Greece's membership of NATO. I think the case of occupation and fratricide sheds light on the often unintended consequences of war, especially interventions which can change the political landscape of a host country. In Britain's case, it unwittingly came close to ushering in a hardline communist government in Greece because of its support to the communist resistance group. However, it is also true that the UK's continued support to the Republican Athens group not only ensured its survival, but also prevented the communists from taking power at an earlier point in the war. All this is much easier to see with hindsight, but I think it's a cautionary tale about understanding your partners in wartime and how there should be at least some consideration of balancing wartime imperatives and post-war political interests. It underscores the importance of an intelligence understanding, not merely of the enemy in whatever scenario, but also an understanding of your allies and their motivations. And if you get involved in another country, how you need to be prepared for a holistic strategy if you want long-term success, either for the host country or yourself. The long-term consequences of World War II were felt for years afterwards, demographically, socially, economically. But those consequences for Greece would undoubtedly have been much worse had Britain not intervened and then was at the helm of an international effort. The UK, US-led relief and reconstruction effort treated Greece in a holistic way. The physical health of the population was prioritized, but the economic health and an even-handed justice system were crucial for longer-term stability. When I was involved in studies for the Ministry of Defense on Iraq and Afghanistan, I wish people had read these lessons. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.
Hello, folks. I'm going to talk today around a chapter I'm working on for the Routledge history of the Second World War on Britain's war, and specifically conservatism, radicalism, and global conflict in Britain, 1939 to 1945. And engaging with this issue, and I point out this is a first draft, so any and all feedback would be heartily welcome. I was struck by this dynamic that the Second World War was a revolutionary war, yet Britain did not fight it in a revolutionary manner. I think it's worth saying that again. Second World War was a revolutionary war, but Britain did not fight it in a revolutionary manner. And that comes out of a reading of Dan Todman's recent work and David Edgerton and thinking again about some of my own. And for those who are thinking about the current crisis, I guess we can also ask the question, is this a revolutionary moment, and are we dealing with it in a revolutionary manner? So in the context of the Second World War, the conflict witnessed the expansion of the existing structures of the British state, says David Edgerton, with their distinctive needs and procedures, rather than a takeover of the state and nation by mobilized people. The wartime British state was the creation of the existing elite, the work of businessmen, not of socialist planners, of soldiers rather than public health physicians. In reality, Churchill and his right-wing ministers ran the home front, the war economy, and the military operation of the war. As a consequence, and this is my core argument really, Britain struggled to motivate its lower middle and working class army, which led to poor performance on the battlefield and the undermining of Britain's place in the post-war world. In equal measure, the army's struggles influenced the duration of the conflict and drew other key cohorts of the population, such as women, into sustaining the wartime economy. In both cases, the character of the experience radicalized and encouraged people to vote Labour in 1945 with all the changes to the political economy of the United Kingdom that entailed. So my brief plan for this short paper is to quickly talk about the culture of war in Britain, how that related to military performance, to think a bit about how class especially played out for the three services during the war, and then reflect in a bit more detail on how all this played out on the geopolitical and the socio-political stage. So the issue of class inequality was, according to Sonia Rose, absolutely central to the wartime nation. This was in part due to the repercussions of the high unemployment and economic insecurity of the interwar years, but also due to the rearticulation of the social question during the war itself. For many, the war was not an end in itself. You've got to remember this, it was about more than the defeat of totalitarianism. It was a step on the road towards a greater aspiration, political and social reform, a better life for individuals. In this great crisis of the state, the way in which the wartime coalition managed the economy of sacrifice was therefore key to how well they could mobilize the masses and encourage them to new heights of personal and collective sacrifice. Now, reading Todman's recent book, you get the sense of Churchill's reluctance to talk about social change during the war. His argument was that we can talk about changing society once the job is done, once the war is won. And you can understand his position, I think, to a fair extent. The problem was the shelving, in a sense, of the Beveridge report, the reluctance to fully embrace a radical approach to the war had implications for collective morale and the perspectives that people experienced. There was a sense of disappointment, I think, in the home front, and certainly, as I'll talk about in a minute, on the battlefront. So it had implications for military performance. So Britain starts the war with, I think, a fairly clear and sensible strategy. Machines would replace men. They'd learn the lessons of the First World War. Britain would use its might at sea and in the air to attrit an enemy, while its allies on the continent dealt with assumedly Germany in the land domain. This, as David Edgerton has said, was a distinctive British form of liberal militarism, a thoroughly modern way of war. The material manifestations of British strategy would be productive factories, large battleships, long-range bombers, and the most modern artillery. And in the domains in which it expected to fight, you'd have to say Britain converted this power into pretty remarkable combat performance. In the space of science and creativity, there was the cracking of Enigma, Britain's contribution to the development of the atom bomb. The Royal Navy broadly covers itself in glory, apart from a few well-publicized missteps. And even the Royal Air Force, apart from the ethical issues that are still powerful and with us today, it had, as recent scholarship has suggested, think of Payson O'Brien and Nick Stargart's work on the German war, the bombing war had material and psychological effects on Germany. But the experience of the army was more mixed. The disasters in France put paid to the prevailing plans. Britain would have to play its full part in a land war. The army, however, had to rely disproportionately on the very citizens who had suffered most from the trials and tribulations of the interwar years, and who were most touched by the spirit of reform catalyzed by the war itself, the lower, middle, and working classes. I'd be interested, so the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force also relied on these demographics, right? But the structures of combat in the air and sea domains, I would argue, limited the influence of these individuals on combat outcomes. So the captain of an airplane or the captain of a ship had more control perhaps over his subordinates, than a captain or a major or a brigadier in the jungle, as Ignacio has already discussed, right? It's very hard to control in those types of environments. So individuals could enter and exit the battle space with a bit more freedom in the land domain, arguably, than they could in the air and the sea domains. Thus, the army faced a profound challenge. Its rapid expansion during the great crisis unleashed by the defeat of France meant that for much of the first half of the conflict, soldiers went into battle imperfectly trained. In this context, much depended on the individual's willingness to fight and his personal attitude to the war. And censorship summaries and morale reports and all sorts of other metrics and tools give us a sense that the British soldier was generally very disappointed about the lack of kind of radical promises for a post-war world, certainly as encompassed in the Beveridge report. It went through the censorship summaries like wildfire. And so this has issues. This plays out in terms of the soldiers' morale, and then this follows towards the performance of the army. And that had consequences. The war became a long war. Britain's inability to get it done quickly had implications, as Daniel Todman has said, for the cost Britain would pay in terms of blood, treasure, and power. The blockade, no matter how good the job carried out by the Royal Navy, the blockade was always going to take time. The bombing war was always going to take time. It was only the most radical of those who thought you could get the job done from the air that thought the war could be finished from the air alone. So it was the army really that was the driving force in terms of the duration of the conflict. And things started to play out then in this complex, interconnected fashion. Defeats in North Africa in 1942 ended hopes, certainly American hopes, of getting onto the continent in 1943, or even 1942, but certainly 1943. The slow attritional fighting in Tunisia had implications for what was going on in India. Shipping was moved from the Indian Ocean to help supply the fighting in Tunisia, which meant when there was famine in India and Bengal, there was less shipping available to deal with the crisis, which then played out in terms of the perspectives of Indians with regards to the empire. Sicily and Burma, or the slow attritional gains that were made in those campaigns, certainly in 1943, diminished Britain's standing in the eyes of the Americans. British hopes of provoking an Axis collapse and a quick end to the war, while her relatively advanced military mobilization still gave her a powerful role within the Grand Alliance, were therefore unfilled. You can see on the right there, since the number of British and Commonwealth divisions in contact with the enemy in comparison to US divisions. And certainly by mid-1944, the power dynamic is significantly shifted, as you can see. So post-war British interests were now shaped by new realities on the ground, because the British and Commonwealth armies didn't get the job done quickly. The Americans and the Red Army starts to dominate in terms of land offensives. And the economic consequences of the Long War are immense. Britain is faced with another Dunkirk, right, at the end of the war, a financial Dunkirk. Britain now needs to borrow masses of money from the Americans. And there are, caveats, there are conditions attached to that massive borrowing. So when Britain is faced with crises in India, in the post-war period, in Burma and Palestine and Greece, not only is it struggling to find manpower, but it's struggling just to pay to keep these problems under control. And ultimately it cannot, because it doesn't have the money. So the Long War, every day that goes by, more is borrowed, more is owed, has implications for British power. These consequences also play out in the socio-political domain. So Labour's victory in 1945, you could argue, and many have, was underpinned by the service vote and that of women. The shortage of manpower in industry was made good by women, largely from the same socio-economic background as the army. Official policy towards women, however, shifted only marginally during the war years. Britain fought a revolutionary war, but did not fight it in a revolutionary manner. There was little progress on equality of pay. Revolutionary proposals for the socialization of housework were deflected amid concerns that such proposals would lead to the deterioration in the standard of domestic life, and efforts to ease the load on female workers through the provision of childcare facilities and the altering of the rhythms of contemporary female life, such as shopping, cooking, and cleaning, proved largely ineffective. The increase in female participation in the workforce came mainly from one key demographic: married women, older married women. As Army morale reports attested, the low rates of soldiers' pay meant that many wives had little choice but to join the wartime economy, even though they were not officially compelled to do so. So by 1943, about 43% of women in paid employment were married, about a third of whom had children under the age of 14. The guilty secret of Britain's Labour policy during the conflict, according to Geoffrey Field. So the dynamics were now in place for a coalition of interests to play out at the ballot box. The Conservative Party, as Michael Candea has argued, was beaten in 1945 because key sections of the electorate, the working classes, the lower middle classes, and women, who were all traditional Conservative voters, did not think that the party was sufficiently serious about post-war reconstruction and reform. The young, the lower middle classes, and the upper working classes, the precise cohort of society that were disproportionately drafted into the army and into female war work, found themselves disinclined to vote Conservative. So what does all this tell us about today's problems? That we have to ask ourselves, are we in a revolutionary moment, and are we reacting in a revolutionary way? The duration of the conflict seems to be absolutely essential. So the inability of the army to get the job done quickly in the context of 1940, as opposed to 1945, had implications in terms of treasure and in terms of the domestic situation. The problem isn't simply mobilization, it's remobilization. How do you keep people going? If there's a second wave, if there's a second lockdown, if there's a third lockdown, how do we maintain public willingness to serve, to sacrifice? Thank you very much.
I think I'm just going to repeat what I said. We have had one question from the audience. Those of you who are on Zoom would like to ask questions, please do so. While we're doing that, I have a couple of questions for our speakers. I was struck by comparisons and contrasts over the range of things we heard. For example, modern Greece and ancient Greece seem to have similar experiences. Also, Kunika began by mentioning the way we're drawing analogies from the past with the present situation. And I'd like to ask questions whether that is appropriate. I certainly listened to Jonathan Fennell's final presentation, drew some analogies not only with Britain coping with the coronavirus crisis today, but also with my own understanding of how they approach making war between 1914 and 1918. Perhaps I could ask each panelist the appropriateness of such analogies for helping us understand contemporary experiences. Thank you.
I'm happy to speak, or do you want one of the PhD students to have a chat?
Jonathan, please.
Sure. I think the historian's natural response is that the past can't provide us with policy or solutions, really. It can help us understand the component parts of problems and help us think about how they interrelate. So, yeah, that's about it, really. It requires then intelligent people in the face of the current crisis to understand what they're facing, come up with creative solutions to that crisis. So the past helps us understand what factors might be important, but certainly doesn't tell us what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think if you look at the participation of historians in these kinds of events, or political scientists, humanities, social science practitioners, it's usually in terms of the ideas and the concepts of societies or states and how they act as a whole, where we get our best value in terms of being able to participate. And as Jonathan says, being able to highlight different types of outcomes, to provide experience. It's really the way in which, if you're a doctor, you're doing your statistical analysis, you want track and trace, they have their archive of similar disease. So, in the same way we do that for society and for the state, how does it react? The big issue is, of course, being careful about making sure that what our comparisons are linked to are appropriate. It's not a one size fits all. And that's where the real detail and the hard graft comes in, trying to make sensible, logical connections between the past and the present and being able to see how that takes us in the future. It's not easy being able to marry the three temporal positions, and particularly with evidence, the thing that other professions, aspire to always have, economists and engineers and others who can give you raw, hard facts. We have lots of facts. It's hard to make the case that this evidence is just as valid and just as valuable as any other discipline. Can I speak to, somebody asked a question about language and the use of language. Let me just check. It was about whether or not the way in which language during the COVID-19 is being used. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the German use of language during this crisis, it's all about things that have to do with kind of sports, endurance, resilience, marathon. It has to do with more of the personal attributes and the kind of higher, same was true in Greece, where they're much more about social or family types of representations, that these things have an impact. It's the Anglo-American sort of dealing with, at least that I've had visibility of, where war is seen as being this way in which our societies come together, and we're supposed to be able to, in terms of what Jonathan was talking about at the end of his presentation, to unify, to create morale or will, and being able to take what is usually the chaos of democracy and make it more coherent, more like an autocracy, and more responsive to the greater need as opposed to the individual good. I think the sport metaphor is certainly one that I find more attractive and more appealing to the individual and the individual's responsibility and accountability, as opposed to the kind of the militaristic one. And I mean, particularly, over the past decades, we've become very used to this idea about the war on everything, wars on poverty, war on education, war on this, war on that. And it's I would say, a pretty bankrupt kind of societal reference point if war is what it is that we think is kind of the ultimate sacrifice or the ultimate type of thing that it is to galvanize us into a coherent, unified act. And so I'm quite struck by some of the other European approaches to what they were using as being their kind of template or their strategic narrative embedded into what imagery. And I thought, you know, it was pretty effective too. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a range of questions coming in, some of them quite long, and I haven't had a chance to read them all. So while I read some long ones, I'm going to throw out a question from Alan James, who suggests that Kunika's paper was certainly a bit optimistic. Are other panelists feeling more pessimistic about our COVID or even hopefully post-COVID future?
Well, to Alan's observation, I think with the Athenians' case there's a sort of temporary disruption in their democratic system, and they've had the oligarchic government installed twice within a period of 10 years, but then they go back to being, you know, another sort of more heightened democracy, and they have a sort of second resurgence of empire. So I think maybe directly applying the ancient case to the modern, again, as I said in my paper, that it's a little bit spurious sometimes, so that's maybe not appropriate. But I think at the same time, this is just, I like to think of COVID-19 as just another hiccup. Like, you know, when we first had the HIV and AIDS outbreak, people are kind of feeling very negative and desperate. But then as, you know, we have 20, 30 years on, now it is pretty, not curable, but we can live with it. And I think with the COVID-19, obviously that affects more of us than something like HIV, but I think we can just cope with that impact in a longer term. It just feels very pessimistic because I think right now we're still all, you know, working from home and not being able to see people and that kind of thing. So I think that's perhaps why there's an element of pessimism, but I don't think in the long run it's going to be as negative impact. But then that's just my personal opinion.
Do you have a view on this? Do you have a more positive or negative view of the prospects after COVID?
I think the outcome would depend on the level of patience and perspective that we can show regarding this historical process. Maybe that's the biggest value of this experience and this comparison between former generations and our generation. If we are able to stay calm in difficult times and to open our minds and remember how former societies deal with this kind of problems, maybe we will have a better outcome if we want every single day a new answer and a solution and a vaccine, or maybe solutions to our financial problems or whatever you can imagine. So maybe a recommendation would be take some time, make some readings, try to assess this in terms of historical process rather than just a simple accident in time.
Thank you, that's interesting. That leads to another question I was going to present to you. Derek Williams asks, is it one of the differences that historians, one has the benefit of doing events with the benefit of hindsight, whereas the COVID governments are asked to make decisions with imperfect information now? That does raise the question whether government should be better informed about what has happened in the past. Would you like to reflect upon this? We have the advantage of historians being able to reflect in moments of calm and not deal with the moments of crisis ourselves.
I think that's a great question because, you know, one benefit of having a historian's trade under your belt, you're given a sense of stability and confidence, and you're less inclined to have knee-jerk reactions to current events. And I don't think it's coincidental. If we look at various governments, the people who are most measured are typically, dare I say it, historians by background. The best intelligence analysts come out of the history school. And I think the problem with, it's not reserved to politics and democracies, but the short-termism that we see, particularly in Britain and UK, you get the political classes reacting to very short-term crises, rather than that sort of longer-term strategic thinking that I think might have characterized previous governments. But it's an observation that I've made. If you look at people within sort of wider government, who are the sort of steady people who offer the most sage advice? Very often they do tend to be historians, because they can see the full span of history and they're less inclined to knee-jerk reactions. But it's also true in the current context that politicians are very focused on the sound bites and the media coverage. So their perspective is, at the end of their nose. So how can we formulate strategy if the political classes are all like that? And furthermore, she says pointedly, if there is a disregard of the sort of longer term permanent members of the civil service who've been in post for decades in some case, who offer that sort of feeling of stability, that concerns me profoundly, that you've got a sort of political mechanism now that is very short-termist and tends to be dismissive of the more long-term members of government. Just a few thoughts.
Like to respond on that point? Another question from Monica Lai. COVID-19 raises question of globalization, and many argue countries may retreat from cooperation. I was certainly struck myself when I heard the presentations. We're dealing with national shocks and global repercussions, or global shocks and national experiences thereof. But Monica goes on to say, is it necessary for governments to cooperate together at the moment? And what do you think the chances are for countries to work together? Do I want to answer that one? Other questions? Question, you mentioned that there's no enemy, Greg and Jonathan. Do we require, therefore, to redefine what our enemy is?
I think Greg's point about this was well made earlier. I mean, we're using the language of war, but this is not a war. This is a pandemic, and pandemics are like pandemics. And so we'd be better off using the language of science, of medicine, to help us understand what needs to be done. Now, at the same time, any crisis requires a certain level of mobilization and remobilization, which requires emotive language, ways to get the population on board. And certainly in a country like this, where you have a strong memory of the Second World War as a moment of unity and powerful common purpose, you can understand why military language is used, but it is ultimately imprecise. It is used for mobilization rather than actual clear direction in terms of what needs to be done. So I buy what Greg said earlier, really.
And a short question, what does history tell us about what civilians, individuals, we can do to moderate our personal responses to the crises? Because, of course, we can give these big pictures on reflection of states, but what? I think Jonathan's presentation indicated that the outcomes are based on the experiences and actions and decisions of individuals. What can we as individuals do in these circumstances?
Do one of the PhD students want to have a shot at that?
Well, it's it's a difficult one, especially to trying to give advice to how to engage with this kind of situations. And we know, at least in my perspective, that self-discipline, training, acknowledgement can help you to engage in this kind of situations in a better shape. So in terms of how to deal with this kind of situations, and we can see it here in the UK as well. You have political instructions, you have the government instructions. At the same time, you have individual responsibility to engage with those instructions. So at some point, you need to be aware that you are part of this problem and you're part of this solution as well. Maybe you can have instructions whether to go out and meet people or use the public transport or just stay at home or whatever. But at the same time, you have a responsibility with yourself, with your family, with your friends, with your community to try to be part of the solution and not try to just follow the instructions. And that's pretty similar to the case of, I guess, the case of the military personnel engaged in combat operations. You can find that in this very amazing book, Men Against Fire of S.L.A. Marshall in 1947. The idea of Americans training the new recruits with new tools to engage this complex reality and how they could assess the chaos of combat, not only with military training, but also with another intellectual tools. And it's interesting also to think in the case of the American Army at West Point, they have a very interesting curriculum of courses related to liberal arts and philosophy and history and political science and how to engage in different environments when they know that when they finish that training, they are going to be deployed in very difficult conditions in Iraq, in Afghanistan, or somewhere else. They are having big issues now inside the American society. So it's not only about discipline and military or the idea of the warrior ethos. It's about your participation as an individual in this kind of organizations, especially in moment of crisis.
We're running out of time, but historians are not inclined to predict the future. But I think we'll end with an interesting question, at least based on your understanding of the past. How well are we doing so far in the global or the national COVID crisis? And blend that question if all our panelists might like a brief observation.
If I can stick my neck out as the first responder to that, I think what concerns me is the lack of proper strategic thinking within government. That I think is quite alarming. We had the benefit of politicians of the sort of Maggie Thatcher era who had at least some experience of what a war of national survival was like. But the concern I have in the current situation is the lack of strategic thinking.
Anyone else like to offer an observation?
Well, the schools have just reopened, so you could say we've just put little children on the front line in the battle against COVID-19, and that maybe helps us think about how well we're doing.
I'll take that one personally. My children went back to school this week. And I think I shall wrap things up now with a couple of minutes left, but I'd like to thank our panelists for a broad range of insights, which gives us indication that although what we're dealing with now is a specific, approaching it with contemporary methods and having some successes and making some mistakes, we do have a lot of historical parallels to draw upon, and we can take comfort in the fact that previous global shocks, we have made progress, I think I'd use that expression, afterwards, but not with ease or consistently. I'm aware that we had a range of questions that we were unable to answer. So thank all those who have sent in questions. I appreciate that some have been answered individually by panelists and some were addressed to individual panelists who I hope will still be able to respond, type answers to their questions once we close the session. But I think we've had a good start to our conference. I hope you will sign up for some of the other sessions which are addressing other themes of contemporary relevance over the next 3.5 days. Thank you for our panelists.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you all.